today, you still think Ukraine can take Crimea by the end of the summer?
Absolutely, if we give them what they need. I mean, this whole thing, not just Crimea, the whole thing could be over by the end of this year. It's up to the United States, and I think UK and Germany and others would follow along if the United States made it very clear that our desired strategic outcome is that Ukraine defeats Russia on the battlefield and fulfills all that President Zelensky has described as what victory looks like.
In this video, Ben Hodges discusses the challenges faced by Ukraine in the context of potential joint combined attack. The Ukrainians are expected to confront various obstacles, including crossing the Dnipro River and facing minefields, dragon's teeth, trenches, old tanks, anti-tank weapons, and artillery. The Russians are well prepared for this, with accurate intelligence and extensive practice. Hodges highlights that it is unlikely Russia would use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, as the Russian General Staff understands the implication of doing so, especially for their own future in a post-Putin era. Additionally, Ukrainians would continue to fight even if Russia employed a tactical nuclear weapon against them. Regime survival is Putin's main concern, and he may resort to using a nuclear card if his survival is threatened, connecting it to Crimea. Ben Hodges emphasizes that Ukraine requires long-range precision weapons, the ability to strike targets in Crimea, and the endurance to sustain the conflict for a potentially long period. However, Ukraine currently lacks the stamina for a prolonged fight, while Russia's endurance is also questionable. Hodges points out that Ukrainian soldiers and people possess greater willpower than their Russian counterparts, and that Russia's defense industry is in a weakened state. This provides a glimmer of hope for Ukraine in the event of an attack. During the Munich Security Conference, Senator Mitch McConnell aimed to reassure attendees of the United States' commitment to Europe, NATO, and Ukraine, emphasizing that Donald Trump is unlikely to become the next president. Governor DeSantis is identified as Trump's main challenger. Ben Hodges discusses the challenges and obstacles Ukraine would face in a joint combined attack, emphasizing the need for long-range precision weapons, the ability to target locations in Crimea, and the endurance to sustain a potentially long conflict. While Russia is unlikely to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, Putin's focus on regime survival could lead to dangerous escalations. The resilience of the Ukrainian soldiers and people, combined with the weakened state of Russia's defense industry, offers hope for Ukraine in the face of potential aggression. The US's continued commitment to Europe, NATO, and Ukraine is also highlighted, with Senator Mitch McConnell reassuring attendees at the Munich Security Conference.
I know everybody on this call has been trying to figure out why is the administration reluctant to do that. And I think they still are not convinced that Ukraine is able to do it. When I hear the Pentagon repeatedly say, even if they do this big offensive, it might not deliver what we're all hoping. Well, of course not, if we don't give them what they need. I mean, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy by the Joint Staff, and I don't understand that. So I think there's a little bit of psychological, they just still can't imagine that little Ukraine could somehow defeat big Russia, which shows a lack of imagination, but also understanding of what's going on the ground. Secondly, I think the administration is perhaps, and this is 100% speculation on my part, they're not prepared for the outcome if Ukraine defeats Russia. I mean, what happens? You know, and when the dog catches the car, you know, what does it do? And so I think the administration is uncomfortable with the idea, as are many of our European allies, with what happens next. And so I think that's part of the reason they haven't declared we want Ukraine to win. And then the third thing, I don't know this, but I think China is influencing the administration, or considerations about China, that maybe the Chinese have said, we do not want a catastrophic collapse of Russian Federation, which they think might follow the liberation of Crimea. So I've been trying to figure out, how do we influence the administration? And to do that, we'd have to understand, why did they think what they think? So I'm all over the map on trying to figure that out. If we do what Clausewitz says, you know, the political leadership has to describe what is the end to be achieved. That's the job of our civilian leadership. If they do that, then we can accomplish it. In the absence of that, then we're going to continue delivering incrementally. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's the part that's frustrating. Martin Harum, who was the chief of defense from Estonia, this morning, he was quoted as saying that Russia will never be safe from Russia until it breaks up into a lot of little countries. I thought that was a powerful statement from the chief of defense of Estonia to acknowledge that as long as Russia remains the Russian Federation, we're never going to be able to deal with them, or the threat will always be there. And General Sir Richard Sheriff, I heard him the other day highlight the fact that Russia has never been a nation state. It's been an empire of some sort from its very beginning. And because of that, it's never had to reckon with its past. And until it does, we'll keep getting Putin or whoever comes after him. And so this never stops. So this is why I think long term, it's in our interest to make sure that Russia is absolutely defeated, beaten on the battlefield. And then it forces them to have the reckoning that Germany had and that Japan had after the end of the Second World War. What do they need? I think you isolate the Crimean Peninsula by severing the land bridge. And I don't know this, but I think that's what this offensive is going to be about when and where and however it happens. It's ultimately about isolation of Crimea. And then you bring up the long-range precision weapons to begin to make Crimean Peninsula untenable. SACEUR, General Cavoli, said that precision can defeat mass if you have enough time. And Russia's only advantage is mass infantry. And so you neutralize that advantage by going after headquarters, ammunition storage, transportation nodes with precision weapons. It takes some time. If they have that capability, then I think the peninsula becomes untenable for them. And then the third phase, of course, you have to actually enter the peninsula after that and clear it. I think once the Black Sea Fleet's gone, the Russian Air Force is no longer flying there. I think this becomes a much more achievable task. I do think that exactly what Ambassador Herbst said, that the very, very few people know actually how this is going to unfold. And I think they must laugh to themselves when they hear there's so many experts asking, how come the spring offensive hadn't already started yet? Everybody's an expert on what's going to happen. I certainly don't know where or when it's going to happen. But what I do believe is that they have a lot more combat power than we think they do, that they have been, and this would have taken nerves of steel by the general staff and political courage by President Zelensky to withhold some of these newer capabilities, new brigades, to keep them out of Bakhmut, despite the enormous losses that the Ukrainians are suffering in Bakhmut, because they needed the time to get these armor brigades ready that will be used if and when and wherever this counteroffensive actually takes place. And so this would have been a decision in terms of operational art, what we would call an economy of force mission. You needed the troops around Bakhmut, many of which were territorial defense force units, to continue to hold off the Russian forces there to buy time. And I think because of that, there probably are several brigades that are equipped with the Ukrainian tanks and armored fighting vehicles, captured Russian equipment, and then, of course, we know a lot of Western delivered equipment is in the hands, and you've got units that have been training with it. I think the General Staff is having to make a decision. You don't want to attack until the conditions are set. And one of the conditions, of course, is weather, trafficability. But the other condition is, are your guys ready? Have you trained enough to be able to do this? Are you prepared to do it? Do you have the ammunition, the maintenance, all the stuff ready? Because once it starts, you don't want to stop. I mean, you want to get momentum and keep going. And then, of course, the enemy. One of the conditions is, what is the enemy? What have they been able to do to confuse the Russians about where, when, how this is going to happen? So there's a lot of factors, and I think the General Staff deserves the patience and our confidence. Based on what they have done over the past 14 months, I am very impressed with how they've done this. And, once it does happen, we'll all be slightly surprised, like, oh, dang, I didn't think of that, or wow, that was really something. And that's as it should be. I think I would hate to be a Russian private sitting in one of these open trenches right now, anticipating pretty soon I'm going to be looking up the business end of a Ukrainian tank. There's no doubt that Ukraine is expending enormous amounts of ammunition, but the specifics are something that they would have protected very carefully. So we don't know how many troops they actually have or how many casualties they've actually had. I don't imagine we have a very accurate sense of what ammunition they have. The good news is the United States and others, but the United States, our country, has tripled artillery ammunition production in just 1 year. I mean, that's amazing. We were producing 8,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition every month, because that's about what we expend per month for training. It's now up to 24,000 rounds a month, and they plan to triple that in the coming year. So that kind of ammunition, I don't think there's any delay on pushing to the Ukrainians what they need. But of course, that's not the only thing. It's the air and missile defense capabilities that they need. I think, that was one of the things that was in the leaks that came out. That would not have been a huge surprise to anybody. But if that is in fact the case, then hopefully the administration is moving out on it. And I think that was one of the priorities from last week's Ramstein contact group. So when U.S. Grant was the commander of the Union Army, when he took command of the Army of the Potomac, and he was beset with worrisome subordinate commanders. They were like, "Oh my God, you better watch out. Robert E. Lee is going to do this. Robert E. Lee is going to do that. We better be careful. Robert E. Lee is going to do that." And Grant looked at them and said, "I'm sick and tired of hearing what you're worried that Robert E. Lee might do to us. He should be worried about what we're going to do to him." And so it was a change of mindset. Quit worrying so much about what the enemy might do. And we all know this. Russia is not going to use a nuclear weapon. I think the Russian general staff knows that if they did use a nuclear weapon, Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. They're not going to all of a sudden surrender. And so then once they've used a nuke, the Ukrainians keep fighting, then what? So the general staff knows there is no other thing there. So their nukes are only good as long as they don't use it. That's why I think they won't actually use them. The Russian people have no desire for this fight. You could not fill up a school bus with a number of Russian troops that actually really want to be in Ukraine. So, I keep hearing about, oh my God, there's hundreds of kilometers of trenches and dragon's teeth. You've all seen the same video I do. These are open ditches. None of them have overhead cover. And it's the same unlucky, unhappy Russian troops sitting in those trenches that have been getting slaughtered everywhere else. After 9 years, Russia still has not achieved air superiority. They have not destroyed one single train or convoy bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland. Not in 9 years. The Navy, all they can do is launch missiles against apartment buildings, fixed sites. They are not able to hit any moving targets. So I think that people are wringing their hands like, oh, the Ukrainian attack might not succeed. I will take that bet.